I am Ibrahim Traore, and today I'm pulling off your masks. Yes, you heard correctly. I, whom you call a young military junta leader, whom you brand as a dangerous radical, whom you serve up as an anti-Western dictator, am now telling you the truth. And this time you cannot turn off your microphones. This time you cannot turn away your cameras. This time your editors cannot cut this speech, because the world you monopolize no longer exists.
The Sahel's sky was heavy with dust, and the land beneath it was brittle with hunger. For years, Burkina Faso had fought a losing battle against the desert locust, a plague as old as the scriptures, yet as modern as today's crisis headlines. In villages across the savannah, men and women rose at dawn, only to see their hard-earned fields devoured before noon. Sorghum and millet, once waving like golden seas, were stripped to stalks in a single afternoon. Maize fields turned to dust under the marching jaws of caterpillars. For many families, months of toil vanished overnight. The devastation was not new. For decades, cycles of locust and worm outbreaks had stalked farmers from Niger to Mali, from Chad to Burkina Faso. International aid agencies arrived with promises, yet their solutions were tied to bureaucratic procedures and imported chemicals. Pesticides from Europe were shipped in at staggering costs, delivered late and sprayed from planes that often harmed as many crops as they saved. To rural families, this was another burden, another reminder that salvation always seemed to come from outside, slow and poisoned. Wrapped in the language of dependency, Captain Ibrahim Traore, the young officer who had become president, looked at this pattern with defiance. He had seen farmers bow their heads too many times, waiting for solutions dictated from afar. He had seen the way imported chemicals stripped the soil of life, leaving it fragile and weak, and he understood something deeper. Every shipment of pesticide carried not only toxins for the land, but chains for the people. Each barrel meant more debt, more dependency, more silence before foreign donors. In the heart of the crisis, he asked a dangerous question. Could the nation fight this battle with its own hands? With its own wisdom? With its own creatures? His closest advisors shook their heads. His critics whispered that desperation was clouding judgment, yet Ibrahim did not flinch. He turned to a creature often ignored, mocked for its simplicity, the chicken. The idea sounded absurd to international ears. 1,000,000 chickens against the locust hordes? It was laughed off as theater. But Ibrahim saw in these birds something others missed. Each one was a soldier with an insatiable appetite for insects. Each one could consume hundreds of pests in a single day. Multiply that by 1,000,000, and you had an army of wings and beaks. An African army, natural and unstoppable. For him, the choice was more than practical. It was political. It was a declaration that solutions could be born on African soil, without begging, without chemicals, without submission. Standing before Parliament, his voice steady against the waves of doubt, he declared, "This is not chaos. This is strategy." The words carried weight, but they also carried risk. If the plan failed, he would be remembered as reckless, as the captain who turned his nation into a spectacle. But if it succeeded, he would prove that even in the poorest corners of Africa, sovereignty was possible, and creativity could outmatch imported dependency. As the crisis deepened, families sold their animals to buy a few handfuls of grain. Mothers watched their children grow thinner, their bodies robbed by hunger. Markets emptied, prices rose, and despair settled like a fog. In those bleak days, whispers spread that the president was preparing something extraordinary. Rumors of trucks, of crates, of wings ready to be unleashed. The world waited. International journalists sharpened their pens, eager to mock. Aid organizations braced for another failure. Within villages, some prayed, others doubted, but all hoped. For they knew one thing: the old ways had failed them too many times. It was in this crucible of hunger and ridicule that the gamble was born, a gamble that would soon redefine not only the fields of Burkina Faso, but also the imagination of an entire continent. On the morning of the release, the roads of Ouagadougou trembled under the weight of trucks. Crates stacked high with restless birds rattled as they rolled into villages and towns across Burkina Faso. Children ran barefoot to the fields, their laughter mingling with the clucking of 1,000,000 soldiers waiting to be unleashed. Farmers, weary from years of watching their harvests disappear, stood in silence. They wanted to believe, yet disbelief weighed heavy on their faces. Could chickens really save them from the scourge of locusts? From the capital to the remotest province, the nation held its breath. At dawn, officials opened the first crates. Thousands of wings beat against the air, feathers scattering like confetti across the savannah. The birds burst into the grasslands, darting through stalks of millet and maize. Their movements were chaotic, almost comical, but within hours, the truth of the strategy began to reveal itself. Villagers watched as chickens chased swarms of caterpillars and beetles, devouring them with ruthless efficiency. In places where fields had once been stripped bare, a fragile line of green now stood a chance. Farmers murmured, half in awe, half in disbelief. Children shouted, "The chickens are fighting for us!" For the first time in months, hope cracked through the despair. Yet beyond the borders, the spectacle was met with scorn. International reporters called it poultry theatrics and mocked the nation as Burkina Faso goes to the birds. Western commentators warned of wasted millions, of disease outbreaks, fear of chaos masquerading as strategy. Even neighboring leaders whispered doubts, wondering if the young captain had gambled his nation's future on a folly. But Ibrahim Traoré was ready for them. Facing the press with the calm of a soldier, he delivered a disarming reply. Yes, chickens are foolish. But sometimes, the foolish win. His words echoed far beyond the microphones. They disarmed the ridicule, transforming mockery into curiosity. Behind the humor lay an iron conviction. This was not a stunt. It was sovereignty in feathers. Logistics had been daunting. Procuring and distributing 1 million birds stretched the treasury thin. Every province needed its share. Every village needed access. Every field needed its defenders. Teams of logisticians mapped routes, drop points, and feeding zones. Soldiers and council leaders coordinated to ensure chickens did not cluster in one place, but spread wide enough to cover the land. The operation was military in precision, but rural in spirit. Despite the strain, the results began to show. In the first weeks, locust swarms that had blackened the skies broke apart under the advancing front of birds. Damage reports from pilot zones revealed crops surviving where they would have otherwise vanished. Local markets saw eggs appear in greater numbers, selling cheaper than in years past. Families who had tasted hunger now had protein for their children. A gamble once dismissed, as madness was slowly proving itself as method, the release also changed the rhythm of rural life. In village squares, elders who had once doubted spoke on radio stations. No one has ever fought locusts with chickens, but if it is our chickens, then it is our solution. That language of ownership spread quickly. What had begun as a government initiative became a national mission. Families cared for the birds that roamed their fields, feeding them when insects thinned, breeding them for eggs and meat. In the global arena, images of chickens flooding the plains of Burkina Faso traveled faster than any policy paper. What foreign analysts dismissed as absurd became a living metaphor for African creativity. The gamble had captured imagination in a way no technical report could. For Captain Ibrahim, latest news, this was more than pest control. It was a spectacle of defiance. A reminder that the poorest of nations could choose their own path. In every scratching claw and flapping wing was a declaration. Burkina Faso would not beg. It would innovate. The gamble was underway. And though its outcome was still uncertain, one truth had already been established. The world would never look at this small nation the same way again. Weeks passed, and the laughter that once echoed in foreign newspapers began to fade. What had started as ridicule slowly transformed into reluctant curiosity. In the villages of Burkina Faso, the evidence was no longer theoretical. Farmers could see the difference with their own eyes. In fields where chickens roamed freely, sorghum stalks stood taller, maize cobs filled out, and millet no longer vanished overnight. Entire communities whispered in amazement. It works. The change was not just ecological, it was psychological. For decades, farmers had felt invisible, forgotten by leaders who stayed in distant capitals and signed deals with foreign donors. Now, they felt seen. 1 million chickens had become more than birds. They had become a message that their lives mattered, that their survival was worth a national gamble. Markets were the first to reflect the shift. Poultry stalls multiplied in towns, egg sellers appeared along dusty roads, and rural families found themselves with a small but steady income. What had begun as an anti-locust measure was quickly reshaping the rural economy. Instead of buying costly pesticides, villagers invested in simple feed, in cooperatives, in small veterinary services. The cycle of commerce pulsed with new energy, built not on chemicals, but on feathers and grain. One of the most profound aspects of the program was the decision to give 30% of the chickens to women-led households. This was not accidental. Ibrahim Traoré understood that rural women were often the backbone of agricultural life, yet historically excluded from economic initiatives. By putting hens into their hands, he empowered mothers not only to feed their children, but to sell eggs and breed birds for income. Across the countryside, women spoke with pride on local radio. For the first time, the government trusts us with the future. The structure of distribution also mattered. Rather than centralized ministries notorious for inefficiency, the responsibility was handed to local councils. Elders and community leaders ensured that crates of birds were spread evenly, avoiding the accusations of corruption that had poisoned many past programs. In doing so, Traoré gave ownership to the villages themselves. When people looked after the chickens, they were also looking after their own solution. Meanwhile, the political opposition struggled to attack the scheme. At first, they called it wasteful. Then they argued it was unsustainable. But each criticism was drowned out by testimonies from farmers whose fields were saved or mothers whose children now ate eggs daily. To criticize the chickens was to criticize the people themselves. Within months, what had been mocked as poultry theatrics had become politically untouchable. Beyond the borders, something remarkable was happening. Neighboring nations facing their own pest outbreaks began to take notice. Delegations from Niger, Mali, and even Kenya sent quiet observers to walk the fields, speak with farmers, and study the results. Reports suggested that pest damage in zones with chickens had fallen by up to 40% compared to control areas. What had begun as a gamble was starting to look like a regional export in its own right. At home, the language of pride grew stronger. Villagers began saying, "It is our chickens. Therefore, it is our victory." That sense of ownership was precisely what Captain Ibrahim had hoped to inspire. This was no longer charity from the outside. It was sovereignty from within. And yet, the journey was only beginning. Success in the fields was undeniable. But question lingered. Could the program be scaled sustainably? Would disease or ecological imbalance appear later? Could the fragile economy withstand the costs? These doubts remained, but the truth was equally clear. In a nation once dismissed as fragile and dependent, something extraordinary had happened. 1 million chickens had turned from a global joke into a national policy, and for the first time in years, the people of Burkina Faso walked with their heads a little higher, convinced that if this gamble could work, then perhaps many other African solutions could too. So the question began to spread not just in Burkina Faso, but across the continent. If you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say amen in the comments below. The first harvest season, after the release of 1 million chickens, brought results that could not be ignored. Reports from the Ministry of Agriculture revealed that crop losses had been reduced by nearly $70 million worth of grain. For a nation long dependent on imports and foreign aid, this was not just a relief, it was proof. Proof that a homegrown strategy could protect the harvests of Burkina Faso more effectively than barrels of pesticide imported from Europe. As grain silos filled, instead of emptying, food prices in rural markets stabilized. Villagers who once paid dearly for a few handfuls of maize could now afford baskets of grain. Eggs became abundant, selling at prices lower than in years past. Protein intake rose, particularly among children, whose health statistics reflected a sudden decline in malnutrition. For mothers across the Sahel, this was no abstract success. It was food on the table every day. Yet Ibrahim Traoré knew that numbers alone were not enough. Strategy was not only about saving crops, but about shaping perception. He used the momentum of the chicken program to reposition Burkina Faso in the global arena. At the African Union Summit, he stood before delegates and declared, "A nation that can defend its fields with chickens can defend itself against poverty with courage." The hall erupted in applause. For many leaders, it was not about poultry. It was about defiance, about proof that Africa could craft solutions without waiting for the IMF or the World Bank. Internationally, the optics worked in his favor. Western newspapers that once mocked him as the poultry president now began publishing research papers on avian biological control strategies. Universities dispatched students to study the outcomes. What began as ridicule had been transformed into academic inquiry, then into cautious respect. In the space of a year, the narrative had shifted completely. The diplomatic ripple was even greater. Delegations from Niger, Mali, Chad, and Kenya returned home with stories of fields saved and eggs flooding markets. They pressed their own governments to consider pilot programs. Soon, the idea of a regional alliance emerged, an African poultry corridor that would allow chickens, feed, and veterinary expertise to move freely between Sahel states. Cheap, scalable, and symbolic of solidarity, the plan resonated widely. Ministers from ECOWAS began to study its feasibility, marking the first time a regional agricultural defense strategy was led not by donors from outside, but by Africans themselves. At the same time, Traoré leveraged South-South partnerships to expand the program. China agreed to help construct processing plants that could turn surplus poultry into exportable meat products. Brazil offered expertise in genetics to improve productivity. India supplied veterinary vaccines, while Russia collaborated on grain storage infrastructure. By aligning his feathered army with partners in the global south, he transformed an ecological gamble into a pillar of international trade and cooperation. For Captain Ibrahim, latest news. This was not just survival, it was strategy on multiple fronts: ecological, economic, and diplomatic. By presenting chickens as both a biological weapon against locusts and a living symbol of sovereignty, he built a story too powerful for critics to dismiss. The financial impact was equally profound. With reduced crop losses, Burkina Faso increased its exports of surplus grain to neighboring countries. The balance of trade improved, and for the first time in decades, international negotiators were forced to treat the landlocked nation as a partner rather than a beggar. In meetings with the European Union, Traoré declared, "We feed ourselves now. If you wish to trade, trade with us as equals." His words stunned the room. They were no longer the pleas of a dependent nation, but the demands of a sovereign one. Behind the headlines, the deeper brilliance lay in how the story was told. Chickens were no longer just animals. They were ambassadors of an idea. They stood for creativity, independence, and the audacity of a small country to stand tall in a world of giants. And as global food insecurity worsened with climate change, the world could no longer laugh. The gamble had become a weapon of statecraft, and in the hands of Captain Ibrahim, it was being wielded with precision. By the second year of the Great Release, the chickens of Burkina Faso were no longer just livestock. They had become legend. In the markets of Ouagadougou, traders joked that every egg was a feathered bullet fired against hunger. In the villages, murals appeared on clay walls, showing chickens wearing helmets, standing like soldiers before advancing clouds of locusts. Music filled the airwaves, folk songs and hip-hop verses alike, celebrating the feathered army that had turned despair into hope. The transformation was not merely cultural. Statistics told the same story. Malnutrition among children dropped sharply, especially in rural provinces, where eggs had become a daily part of school feeding programs. Farmers reported improved yields, thanks not only to pest reduction, but also to the manure chickens left behind, fertilizing the soil naturally. The cycle was simple yet profound. Crops fed chickens. Chickens protected crops, and both fed the people. What looked like chaos to outsiders was, in reality, an elegant system of regeneration. The government branded it the Sahelian farm of the future. Extension officers traveled across provinces teaching communities how to integrate chickens into their farming cycles. Instead of spending money on imported pesticides, villages invested in feed cooperatives and small veterinary clinics. Rural economies that had once been stagnant began to hum with new activity. Women, in particular, flourished. With 30% of the initial flock entrusted to women-led households, entire families gained stability. Mothers sold eggs at roadside stalls, bought books for their children, and reinvested in breeding stock. In countless homes, the story was the same. Poultry meant dignity. Politically, the chicken revolution became untouchable. Opposition leaders who once ridiculed it fell silent, unable to argue against the testimonies of farmers and mothers. Any criticism now risked alienating the very voters whose lives had improved. The legacy of the million chickens was no longer just the president's gamble. It had become the people's triumph. In Parliament, even his rivals admitted quietly that the policy had shifted the national agenda. For the first time in decades, agriculture was at the center of political discourse. Across Africa, the story inspired imitation. Farmers in Ethiopia and Sudan began experimenting with small-scale versions. In Nigeria, lawmakers debated whether an avian pest management strategy could cut billions in pesticide costs. Youth movements on social media created memes showing chickens marching under banners that read, "Africa fights back." The once forgotten Burkina Faso had become a reference point for continental pride internationally. Scholars who once mocked the idea now published papers comparing the chicken strategy to historic ecological solutions. Western think tanks that had predicted ecological disaster were forced to revise their assessments after African universities released transparent studies showing biodiversity benefit. Far from destabilizing ecosystems, the chickens had restored balance by reducing destructive insect populations. But perhaps the most powerful transformation was psychological. For decades, Burkina Faso had been cast as fragile, poor, dependent, a nation living at the mercy of outsiders. The million chickens shattered that narrative. Citizens no longer saw themselves as victims of history. They began to believe in their capacity to innovate, to defy odds, to lead by example. Hope was no longer imported. It was home, grown, feathered, and clucking in every village. The gamble of Ibrahim Traore had become a myth, and myths, as every leader knows, are stronger than policies. Myths live in songs, in laughter, in the way children grow up believing their country is capable of greatness. In that sense, the true victory was not only against locusts, but against despair itself. And so, the question began to spread beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. If chickens could defeat locusts, what other problems might Africa solve with its own hands, its own creativity, its own courage? The world was watching, and Africa, for the first time in a long time, was leading. Years after the first crates were opened and 1 million chickens scattered into the fields of Burkina Faso, the gamble had matured into legacy. What began as a desperate experiment against locusts had transformed into a cornerstone of the nation's identity. The numbers spoke clearly. Grain losses cut by more than half, saving hundreds of millions in imports. Malnutrition among children reduced to historic lows. Poultry industries flourishing, with farmers exporting meat and eggs to neighboring states that once mocked the idea. But the deeper legacy was not in statistics, it was in the spirit of sovereignty. By turning chickens into soldiers of survival, Captain Ibrahim Traoré had redefined what leadership could mean for Africa. He had shown that innovation was not the monopoly of the West, nor was sovereignty something granted by donors. Sovereignty, he declared, was built through bold choices, even when the world laughed. In every egg sold at the market, in every child nourished at school, in every farmer who no longer feared the sky darkening with locusts, the legacy lived on. The chickens had become more than pest control. They were symbols of defiance, resilience, and creativity. They reminded the people of Burkina Faso that their future need not be written in foreign capitals, but in their own villages, with their own hands. Internationally, the narrative endured. At summits and assemblies, Traoré invoked the story with pride. We did not wait for aid. We used our own birds, our own courage. Leaders across Africa listened, inspired by the proof that even the smallest nation could bend history with audacity. What was once dismissed as theater had become scripture in the book of African self-determination, and so the 1 million chickens marched into memory, not as a joke but as a parable that whispered across borders, Africa can do it, Africa can rise, Africa can stand. For Captain Ibrahim, latest news, the gamble had paid off not just in the fields, but in the hearts of his people, and as long as the story is told, he will be remembered as the leader who dared to fight with feathers, and won. If this report unveiled a hidden truth for you, do not let it be buried. Like, share, or comment because it's time for Africa. But the story of Burkina Faso and its 1 million chickens is not only about one leader or one nation. It is about the choices Africa faces today and tomorrow. It is about the courage to try what seems foolish, the will to stand when the world expects you to kneel. So we ask you, our brothers and sisters across the globe, what lesson does this story leave for us? Is it simply about chickens? Or is it about a continent reclaiming its right to think differently? If a small landlocked nation could turn ridicule into respect, what might Nigeria, South Africa, or Kenya achieve if they dared to break free from old chains of dependency? And what about us, the global African family, whether in Burkina Faso, Toronto, Lagos, or Kingston? Are we ready to support leaders who gamble for our dignity? Are we ready to believe that sovereignty is not given, but made? this is not the end of the story. It is only the beginning of a larger conversation about food, about freedom, about the future of Africa. The chickens may have scratched the soil of Burkina Faso, but the seeds they planted belong to all of us. If you believe Africa can rise on its own terms, say it proudly in the comments. New Africa.